Okay, so I really want to say thank you to you guys for being patient with me when I was not feeling well last week and not able to do the recording. I didn't think you wanted to listen to an hour of my voice the way it was. So I have posted a revised syllabus schedule, so my hope is that that kind of makes sense to everybody and we can see, we can still cover the stuff that's going to be most important and most relevant. I have deleted Module 7. I just went ahead and deleted that whole thing. So we're not going to do anything for Module 7, and it's not even going to be for extra credit since I've already taken it down and it's off the site. So we'll just do Module 5 and Module 6, and then that'll take us up to the final exam. Take a look at that schedule. If you have questions about it or anything like that, please let me know. Sorry. So in this module, we're covering Chapter 11 and Chapter 12, and those are, Chapter 11 covers the evidence for evolution, and then Chapter 12 covers some mechanisms of evolution. Now, those overlap just a little. They've got natural selection in Chapter 11 and some things, so I'm going to kind of do a little out of order from what the order of the PowerPoint slides are. But most of them are titled, so you should be able to figure out what slide I'm on from recognizing the slide or from. So the first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about evolution. Normally, when I start this section, I write this on the board. I write change over time. That's essentially what evolution is. Evolution is change over time. We use the word evolve a lot in our language. We talk about the evolution of a career. We've talked about the evolution of the space program, with everybody talking about the space shuttle in the last few weeks. News people use it a lot. We talk about it a lot when we talk about how someone has changed. And basically that's because the word evolution just means to change over time, and the assumption or the insinuation is that they become better over time. But if you look at the evolution of a presidency, if you look at the evolution of a politician, if you look at the evolution of a learning program, you're looking at how that has developed and changed over time. And so that's kind of what we're talking about as we're talking about the idea of evolution and the concept of evolution. What we're really talking about is just how things change over very, very large time frames. And so Chapter 12 goes into quite a bit of how we have determined the evidence of evolution. And there's quite a bit of overwhelming evidence that supports evolution. Some of it is the radiometric dating, some of it is the fossil record, some of it is studying strata and layers of the geologic timescale. So I think Chapter 11 is interesting to go through and look at, but a lot of what we're going to focus on about evolution is the mechanisms of evolution, which is in Chapter 12. So I just want to point out a couple of things about Chapter 11 before I move on. The first thing that I wanted to point out was the bit of evidence related to comparative embryology. And this is the idea that embryos of closely related species tend to develop in very similar ways. These are the results of very conserved genes, homeotic genes, that have not mutated much or haven't changed much over evolutionary time. And this is a figure that kind of illustrates this. This is the original figure that I saw that illustrates the idea of comparative embryology. And so when you're looking at this figure, if you look at this very early embryonic stage across the top, it is very difficult to tell the difference between some of these embryos. It's very difficult to tell the difference between some of these embryos that are on this left column and some of these mammalian embryos that are on this right column. And so if we just take a look at this right figure, these embryos that look so very similar at very early stages, that still look similar at the limb bud stage, but grow up to become a pig, a rat, a human. I'm not sure what that fourth one is. And so these are all different mammals that look very different as adults or even in late fetus stage, but in early embryo stages look very similar. And so that's the idea of the comparative embryology. Now, if you search at comparative embryology on the internet, the guy who originally made this drawing's name was Henkel, and there were some people that said, you know, he fudged some of the details of this drawing just a little bit to really make his point, that the embryos don't look quite that similar at the limb bud stage, that, you know, he was really just trying to make a point with this and really just trying to use it to support evolution. Now, if you read those websites, what they say is, because he fudged a little bit on the details, you can't use this at all as evidence for evolution. And we can see that as a very extreme viewpoint. And he even admitted that he did it to some of his friends and colleagues when they called him on it when he was still alive. So, you know, people debate it as if it's not fact. He said, you know, I wanted to use this figure to support evolution, but overall the concept still stands. He would argue that, his colleagues would argue that, scientists still argue that to this day. So the other figure that I want to show you related to comparative embryology is this figure from your book. This is a figure from your book showing several different embryos at the limb bud stage. These are actual photomicrographs. These are not drawings that someone made. And so we can, you know, rely on this more than someone's drawing. If you read the figure legend, it tells you from top to bottom it's human, mouse, bat, chicken, and alligator embryos. And so you can see that there's a stage in all vertebrate embryology where the embryos have similar structures. And the concept is that the similarities and the patterns of embryonic development are the result of these genes that are shared. And so embryos of related species tend to develop in similar ways. And even by looking at the figure that is the photomicrograph, the figure from your book, we can see that that's the case. And so that's one of the ways that comparative embryology kind of supports the idea of evolution. Now, there's some other evidence that your book goes through. Your book talks about plate tectonics, the drifting continents. It talks about morphological convergence. Talks about how we can look at not just the embryonic body form, but the adult body form and see comparisons. And then even more recently, we've come into looking at biochemical similarities and genetic similarities. So, sorry, that was supposed to say biochemical similarities. So we can look at two closely related species, and we can look at the protein for albumin in both of those species. And we can see that they're more closely related than some of the more distant related species. And so they've come up with, you can look at figure 1115 in your book that shows you alignment of the amino acid sequence of a protein that they call cytochrome B. Each of those letters is an amino acid, and you can see that there are significant parts of those proteins that are conserved among pretty closely related species. And then the farther distant the species, the more that changes. So if you compare a honey creeper, which I believe is a bird, to baker's yeast, which is in the last row, they are pretty dissimilar. But if you compare the two birds, honey creeper and the Gough Island finch, they're very, very similar. There's just a few amino acid residues that are different in that protein in those two species. And you can go through species after species and protein after protein, and you see this. More similarly related species have more similar amino acid sequences and genetic sequences. And so from chapter 11, we get the aspects of the evidence of evolution. And then chapter 12 goes into more the mechanisms of evolution, how evolution happens, and where the consequences for species relate using these mechanisms. So when we talk about evolution, frequently you hear people talk about survival of the fittest. That's an idea that came with Darwin. We now tend to refer to this as natural selection. And it's one of the mechanisms for how evolution takes place. So when Darwin was doing his studies, he realized that in any population or in any species, some individuals have traits that make them better suited to the environment than others, and therefore more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce. And the reproduce is the part that's important for natural selection. So we say survival of the fittest, but natural selection really should be reproduction of the fittest, because we're talking about what genes we can send on to the next generation. So some of the keys to natural selection depends on traits, and those traits have to have a genetic component. And we'll see that in just a minute. And those traits have to make the individual more likely to survive and reproduce. Because that's the only way those genes will get passed along to the next generation, is not only if they survive and they're sterile, it's not advanced natural selection as much as if they survive and reproduce. And the next few slides, we're going to go through this and so you'll see. So a person's an individual, whatever species you're talking about, an individual's fitness is how well adapted they are, their degree of adaptation to an environment. As humans, we kind of manipulate our environment pretty well. So if you're somebody who's prone to heat stroke, you just stay inside over the past few days when it's been really hot, and then you're able to survive and reproduce. If you were in a natural environment that didn't have air conditioning, someone who was better able to adapt and survive the heat would have better fitness than someone who is not able to adapt and survive the heat. The word adaptation we use a lot as a noun to talk about an adaptation. And so a lot of books are going to try to use the term adaptive trait, because adaptation can actually describe a process, so it can actually be more like a verb. Okay, that person has great adaptation to that environment, or they have an adaptation. So in order to be less confusing, we're starting to use the word adaptive trait, and I try to use adaptive trait instead of an adaptation. So an adaptive trait or an adaptation is whatever that trait is that gives that person better fitness. So if that person is better adapted to their environment, it's because they have a trait that helps them. That trait is their adaptation or their adaptive trait. Again, these traits are all having a genetic basis. These traits are some sort of physical phenotype that comes from a gene and having a genotype. So Darwin concluded that process of natural selection which occurs because there is variation in fitness and the ability to adapt to the environment, is a driving force for populations changing over time. So if you look at a population over time and you see differences, some of those differences are because of natural selection. And we're going to look at some specific examples of that in chapter 12, but here in chapter 11, it's just kind of being introduced. So this is a table that's giving some of these basic principles about natural selection before we then try to look at specific examples in population. Sometimes it doesn't really click and make sense until we look at those specific examples. So once we do look at those specific examples, we can come back and talk about some of this stuff again, or you can listen to this part of the archive again, and it might make a little more sense. So in the individuals in populations are reproducing. And so that group should have the capacity to increase in size over time. And so if that group doesn't increase in size over time, then you can look at some of the reasons for that. As that population expands over time, it uses resources. And those resources eventually become limited. And when those resources are limited, not everyone can survive. Then we can go back and think about some of the things we know about genetics. Individuals of a species share certain traits. They vary in the details of those shared traits, and those traits have an inheritable basis. They come from genes. We can have slightly different versions of those genes called alleles. So, all human beings have hair color. Most human beings have hair color. But human beings vary in the details of hair color. Some people have blonde hair, some people have brown hair, some people have red hair. Some people have any of the variations in between. Those variations come from alleles for the gene for hair color. And so then we can come to these conclusions based on those observations that we've made. A certain form of a trait may make its bearer better able to survive and therefore leave more offspring. So an allele associated with an adaptive trait that makes its bearer more able to survive tends to become more common in a population over time. So I have an example. It's from a different textbook. So if you want to take a look at this figure, I've put it in the PowerPoint. This might be one that you want to print out in a large size, or it might be one that you want to take a look at in PowerPoint so that you can see the colors are kind of important in it. But this is a really excellent example of natural selection at work. So we have a population of bugs. This is our initial population of bugs up here at the top. There are 5 bugs in this initial population. 4 of them have an allele that's denoted by the color green, and the 5th bug has a version of that allele. And they tell you that that allele confers resistance to a pesticide. It might be an enzyme that can break down the pesticide before it has a chance to kill the bug. It might be a protein that makes the bug's exoskeleton harder so the pesticide can't get through. But whatever it is, it's a gene that confers some resistance to the pesticide. So then we apply pesticide, that's that kind of gray looking cloud, we apply pesticide to this population. And what happens is the bugs that had the green allele all die from the pesticide. But that one that had the genes that conferred resistance to the pesticide survived. It's hard to reproduce if you are dead. It is hard to have sex if you are a dead bug. It is hard to have bug babies if you are a dead bug. So only the survivor is the one that's having bug babies. And so pretty soon, the population we end up with all has the same allele. The population has this allele, and it has increased in frequency. It has become more common. So we met these criteria. A certain form of a shared trait may make its bearer better able to survive. The bugs that had the red allele survived. The bugs that had the green allele did not. The individuals that are better able to survive tend to leave more offspring. Because again, it's hard to have offspring if you're dead. It is hard to reproduce if you're dead. And so in our example population in our bugs, the adaptive trait became more common over time, became much more common over time. Instead of being 1 out of 5, instead of being in 20% of the bugs, it was in 100% of the bugs. So a lot of times when we're talking about some of these processes, we can talk about gene frequency. And again, we go from a gene frequency of 20% in this top population to 100% in this other population. Changing gene frequencies is one way that we can tell that evolution has occurred. That's change over time, change in those gene frequencies. And so change in allelic frequencies tells us that evolution has occurred, tells us that natural selection has occurred. And so natural selection is the mechanism of evolution that's at work here. Now we can go on to chapter 12, where they revisit natural selection. And there are 3 types of natural selection that we talk about. And so looking at these helps with some of the concepts that we were talking about in some of the slides we were just looking at, where we're talking about some sort of environmental influence that causes the population to change. And so we can look at these one by one. The first one to look at is directional selection. And this is a mechanism of natural selection in which one of the more extreme phenotypes is favored. And they give you lots of examples in your book and lots of figures. We can look at the figure. So here's butterflies. And the trait that we're looking at here is the color of the butterfly. There are some lightly colored butterflies. The more medium colored ones are in the middle, and there are some more darkly colored butterflies. And so we're looking at the range. The arrows tell you what's favored and what's not favored. So here, the darkly colored butterflies or moths are favored. So over time, the population shifts so that there is a greater frequency of the allele score and the individuals that have that favored phenotype. This is directional selection because it's kind of moving in the direction of the favored phenotype. So let's think about this again. Natural selection depends on traits that have a genetic basis. And then natural selection occurs because of changes in the environment that favor one of those traits over another. So the example they give you is moths. They have lightly colored moths and darkly colored moths. Something happens to the trees. The trees become more dark. And so the birds flying around can't see the moths that are darkly colored against the dark bark of the dark tree, but they can see the more lightly colored ones. And so those moths get eaten. And they are dead. Because usually when you get eaten, you die. And again, it's hard to reproduce if you're dead. It's hard to reproduce if you are a moth in a bird's cubby. The dark moths all go, I didn't get eaten by the bird today. I can reproduce. And so that's how those allele frequencies change over time. And so again, what we see is it makes sense. The dark moths are more adapted to the environment, and so they survive. But when you actually are looking at what happens, you are seeing the allele frequency change. You are seeing an increase in the number of alleles that means dark, that confer whatever the protein is that colors those moths dark. And so by seeing an allele frequency, that tells you natural selection has occurred. The third kind of disruption that we had seen is called disruptive selection. And this favors both extreme phenotypes. So here we're favoring this phenotype and this phenotype, and nothing in the middle. Perhaps there are two types of trees that these moths can live on in this area. One has dark bark and one has very light bark. So the moths can hide on the dark trees, and the light-colored moths can hide on the light trees. But the moths in the middle that have a little bit of color but not a lot don't blend into either tree. They don't blend into the light tree because they have a little bit of color, but they don't blend into the dark tree because they're not so darkly colored. And so we're favoring the two extremes. So here, instead of moving just to one direction like we saw before, we moved to that direction and the other direction. We moved to the two extremes. So we should end up with a population of just lightly colored and just darkly colored moths. And that's disruptive selection. Again, this trait has a genetic basis. And again, we can tell that natural selection has occurred because we've seen a change in the numbers. We've seen a change in the allele frequency. And then the middle kind of selection that we often talk about is stabilizing selection. And this is a mode of natural selection in which the middle ones, the intermediate phenotypes, are favored. And any kind of extreme form don't survive or don't reproduce. And here's the figure that shows you that. The green arrow now is in the middle. It's not on one side or the other, it's in the middle. And so what ends up happening is we diminish our allele frequency for the two extreme phenotypes. And so when we look at all our population, our percent is almost all of those ones in the middle. So natural selection occurs in different patterns depending on the species and what the selection pressure is from the environment. We saw that directional selection is if one extreme is favored. Disruptive selection is if two extremes are favored. And stabilizing selection is if the intermediate phenotype is favored. And you can apply this to lots and lots of different situations. You can apply this to behaviors. Lots of behaviors have a genetic component, especially in animals. If they're very innate behaviors, imprinting that some birds go through upon their birth, or mating rituals that some animals go through. Those are kind of imprinted or genetically determined behaviors. And since they have that genetic basis, then they are subject to this natural selection. And so if you have a group of birds and one of them does the mating ritual better than the others, then that's the bird that gets mated with. And his offspring will have whatever gene conferred on him the advantage, and so they will also have that same advantage, and they will be more likely to mate. And so there's a lot of behaviors as well as physical characteristics. It could be that a bird is better adapted at getting food. Maybe its neck is just a little longer, and so it can reach up higher and get food higher than others. But it has to have a genetic basis. It can't just be that the bird has muscles in its neck that is developed. Unless there's a gene that confers a protein that helps those muscles, then it's not going to have an effect on the population as a whole. It's not going to have an effect on the allele frequency. Maybe that bird can stretch its neck out, and maybe that bird can get more food, and maybe that bird can reproduce more. But if it doesn't have a gene that it can pass on to the next generation, then its offspring don't have that same advantage. And that advantage just dies at that generation. What we're talking about with selection is looking at the population over long periods of time, and not just 1 or 2 or 3 generations, and not just 1 or 2 or 3 mating cycles. If that bird had a gene that made a protein that made it have stronger muscles so that it could get more food, and it passed that gene on to its offspring, and then the offspring had stronger muscles and were more likely to reproduce and passed that benefit on to its offspring, then over time you are going to start to see that allele becoming more frequent in the population, because the people who have the individuals, sorry, we're talking about birds, the individuals that have that gene are more likely to reproduce and pass it on. Yes, so Danielle has it. Danielle's on it. It can't just have a long neck. It has to have a gene for long necks for natural selection to take place. So it could just have a long neck, and it could pass that on to its offspring. But it's not going to change the allele frequency in the population like we're talking about. So when we're looking here, you wouldn't end up with this unless there's a gene for it. Over all of this time, over all of these generations, you wouldn't end up with a difference in allele frequencies unless there was a gene for it. Because there's nothing to pass on generation after generation after generation except for genes. You don't pass on physics unless there's a gene for it. You don't pass on a suntan. If you sit out in the sun and the UV rays cause your skin to make more melanin, then immediately you go and get pregnant, your baby isn't born with a sunburn. But if you have the genes that give you more melanin production so that your skin is naturally darker, then it's likely that your child will be born with naturally darker skin. So there's a physical adaptation that can take place, but unless it has a genetic basis, it won't affect this whole gene pool, and it won't affect natural selection. Does that make sense? Does that help your question? So one of the reasons I like to look at Chapter 11 and Chapter 12 together is that Chapter 11 introduces the idea of natural selection, and then Chapter 12 gives you these examples. And sometimes when you're going through the material in Chapter 11 and they're talking about it kind of as a concept, it doesn't fully make sense until you get to these examples. And so that's one of the reasons I like to look at them both together. So when we first said, some individuals have traits that make them better suited to the environment and more likely to survive and reproduce, but that has to have a genetic component. Now that we look at some of those specific examples, that kind of makes a little bit more sense. They have these traits, they're more likely to survive and reproduce, and if that trait is based on a gene, then we can impact the frequency of the alleles in the population, and that's natural selection. And so that's a differential survival, and that makes the frequency of the alleles in the population increase, more common. That's right. So sometimes when you're looking at sorry, try not to get choked. Sometimes when you're looking at the definition of fitness and the definition of adaptation, and they're kind of giving you these general terms, sometimes it helps to go ahead and look at a specific example and then go back and look at those general terms, and that might help them make a little bit more sense. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is speciation. This is going to help with the discussion board for this week, and this is going to help with the assignment for this week. And so for the discussion board this week, you do not have to comment on other people to be able to get the points for the discussion board this week. You just have to kind of give your argument for and against. I do recommend that everybody go and read everybody's, but I think most of the discussion is going to be kind of, oh, I agree with that, or oh, I think that's interesting, and it's hard for you to come up with the stuff to get your points. So if there is something that you want to say or point out to somebody or whatever, please feel free to do that, but you're not going to be required to do 3 of those to get the point. And so the question I've proposed in the discussion board is to look at dogs and wolves, and let's talk about whether or not we think they're the same species or a different species, and the ways that scientists address those questions. And I actually put a post up that I think clarified that a little bit or gave a little bit more information, and there's some things that we can look at, some resources that we can look at to help with that. So I'm hoping, I haven't been back into the discussion board since I did that on Monday, so I'm hoping that people looked at that and that might be kind of helpful. And then I want to kind of explain some of that here too, in case people didn't see it on the discussion board. So a lot of times we describe a species based on breeding. So can 2 individuals interbreed successfully under natural conditions, produce fertile offspring, and are reproductively isolated from other species? Meaning they don't reproduce with those other species. They reproduce with this species under natural conditions. The offspring are fertile so that they can go on, and so that you perpetuate this species of individual, and they're isolated from other individuals. And so from this, we get basically 2 concepts that we can talk about. One of which is the process of speciation, or how to define species. So species concept, the concept of species. How does a species come to be, and how is the species defined? And then the other concept that comes from this slide that we're looking at is reproductive isolation. And so, so how do we define a species, and then what do we mean by reproductive isolation? Are the two things that we can discuss from that. And so, species concept, the definition I gave you on the other page fits pretty well with what we call the biological species concept. Biological species concept is, can they interbreed? Do they produce fertile offspring? And can that species hate itself? But there's some other species concepts also. This morphological species concept basically says if they look like each other, then they're probably from the same species. The ecological species concept says, if they're in the same environment and they behave the same way, then they're probably the same species. The phylogenetic species concept says, okay, if they come from a common ancestor, then they're probably the same species. If this lineage has been going on for a long time, and this individual had an offspring, and they 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 had an offspring, it's probably the same species as the original. Or we can do the genetic species concept, or the biochemical species concept, where we start to look at the genetics to try to determine how similar two species are. And so these are two websites that I put that I think will help you with the species concept to try to figure out when you're answering your discussion board question, okay, if you use the biological species concept, dogs and wolves can reproduce and produce fertile offspring that are wolf-dog hybrids. So if we're just using that definition of interbreeding, then we might say, yes, dogs and wolves are the same. The other part, do they reproduce together naturally, and are they found in the same environment normally? We don't tend to find domestic dogs and wolves in the same environment. Domestic dogs are a species that has been domesticated. They tend to live with humans. Wolves, no matter what individual stories you may hear, do not live well with humans. They tend to eat human babies. So you can hear stories of an old couple mated a wolf and it lives in their house and whatever, and given the chance, it'll still eat a baby or a cat, trust me. So you can, in that way, use the biological species concept to argue that they're not the same species. They don't live in the same environment. They would not normally interbreed out in nature. It's only when you put two of them together in the same place and make them interbreed that you can get them to interbreed. And so, no, they're not the same species. So you can use that biological species concept to make both arguments. And so that's what I'm encouraging you to do, is to make an argument for and make an argument against using one of these species concepts for, and either the same one or a different one against. And it'll probably be easier to use a different one, to use two different ones. So the morphological species concept says if they look similar, then maybe they're the same species. Well, I think it's probably going to be easier to make the argument that a dog like a husky or a German shepherd is more closely related to a wolf. So if you're looking at those breeds of dogs, then maybe you can use that morphological species concept. But if you're looking at things like a Shih Tzu and a wolf, it's going to be harder for you to make that morphological species concept. So this might require a little bit of web research to learn what the different species concepts are and to learn some definitions of them. But I think that you'll be able to figure out which ones you think support maybe stating that they're the same species, and which ones support stating that they're different species. And so it's very possible that the domestic dog is actually a new species that arose from the existing species. You're seeing them either in the middle of that speciation process or kind of a little bit removed from that speciation process. And so the other thing that we can talk about, the thing that was going off this direction, is this reproductive isolation as part of the speciation process. Reproductive isolation typically occurs after gene flow stops. And then any divergences then lead to speciation. Okay, what the heck does that mean? The divergences they're talking about are things like something that might produce directional selection or something that might produce disruptive selection. So you have something that cuts off part of the population, and there's no longer gene flow. There's no longer interbreeding between that part of the population and the rest of the population. So we've done something to cut off part of the population and to make sure that they no longer contribute genes by reproducing to the rest of the gene pool. Then, if natural selection takes place, that part that we've cut off responds to natural selection, and the part that was the original gene pool may respond to natural selection, but they may be different selective forces, and so they may respond differently. So if we go back and think about our moths, our dark-colored and light-colored moths, perhaps we had a population of moths, and some loggers came in and cut a huge swath down the middle of the forest, and on the right-hand side of the forest could not reproduce with the moths on the left side of the forest. So there's no gene flow between those two groups because they can't get to each other to reproduce. Then suppose the loggers set up some sort of machine in the woods that's producing a lot of black smoke, and it makes those trees all turn black, all have very dark bark on them. And so that's a directional selection. Those trees might be darker than the trees in the other part, and so that group in the right-hand side where the dark trees are responding to directional selection by increasing the allele frequency of the dark allele in their population. Whereas perhaps on the left side of the forest, there's more of a stabilizing selection force. And perhaps that goes on for such a long enough time, and perhaps there's other selective forces at work that cause those two populations to eventually evolve into two different species. And so that's what those sentences mean. Reproductive isolation, then divergences can lead to speciation. So I think this is a good figure from your book because it shows some of these reproductive isolation mechanisms. And then I've also given you a table from a similar textbook that also gives you some of them, and it uses some of the same terms. So either this timeline figure kind of works better for you, or this table figure might work better for you. So these are reproductive barriers between species. These are things that keep from reproducing with each other. Temporal isolation, temporal means timing. So maybe mating occurs at different times of the day, or different seasons of the year. And so if the females aren't in season during the time that the males are reproducing, then that might be a temporal isolation. If the populations live in different habitats and do not meet, that's habitat isolation. Physical incompatibilities is what your book says. So if you cut a large swath of trees out of the middle of the forest and the moths on one side can't get to the other side, that's a habitat isolation, mechanical isolation. Another form of mechanical isolation is physical incompatibility. Structural differences prevent actual physical mating from occurring. Behavioral isolation has to do with sexual attraction. Maybe that bird didn't do the mating dance right, so the male bird is not attracted to the female bird because the mating dance wasn't done right. And gametic isolation, where the gametes don't unite. That sperm is physically incapable of fertilizing that egg. Perhaps fertilization occurs and the hybrid lives, but it's sterile. That's hybrid inviability. Failure to reach sexual maturity is hybrid inviability. If the hybrid is sterile, that's hybrid sterility. Or maybe the hybrids are very weak, that can be hybrid breakdown. Because you can't perpetuate a species if the very first mating is sterile, infertile. That's not going to be a long enough number of generations to get a new species developing. So reproductive barriers are not going to be able to perpetuate a new species in that new group. If the offspring are weak and they get eaten by bears or tigers, or they don't survive to sexual maturity, then you're not going to get a new species developing because the offspring are not going to live long enough to reach sexual maturity and to mature. So these are all barriers between species, between them reproducing and forming offspring. And so the assignment that has you look at, this will be helpful for answering your assignment. Your assignment this week, I was trying to find something that would be interesting and maybe humorous and maybe help with getting the assignment done. And so that I was hoping that might make you laugh a little bit. But this figure in your book and the table will help you in the reproductive isolation part of your assignment. So I only have a couple minutes left because I have to get to a meeting right after this. Danielle, did you have any other questions that I might be able to answer for you? We're actually going to skip Module 6 as required material, and we'll do Module 7. I'm leaving Module 6 up, especially the discussion board, because if people want to do Module 6 discussion board, it can be counted as extra credit. So I will not do a PowerPoint on the immune system, and I will not do a WIMBO lecture on the immune system. But if you want to research an autoimmune disease and post about it on the discussion board, it'll be worth up to 10 points extra credit. What I'll do for next week is the PowerPoint and the WIMBA for Module 7 on endocrine and reproductive system. So because I was out for a week, we're just going to skip Module 6. But I thought it might be an extra credit opportunity, so I wanted to give that to you. So the last thing I have, I thought it was really funny. I just pushed a link out, so you might be able to see the link, or I can probably, I don't know if I can post it on here or not. Okay, good. All right. Should have just pushed a new window out to you that is a Doonesbury cartoon. This was in Doonesbury this past Sunday. This was 3 days ago, which I thought was really funny because I was trying to get the PowerPoint together and everything for you guys. So the top two panels are just a guy and a girl in a high school biology class having a conversation. And then the teacher starts teaching, and he looks like every nerdy biology teacher that you've ever seen. And he's on the blackboard picture behind him. He's got a picture of a cell, and he says, so, all of the evidence massively supports a theory of evolution that knits together everything we know about biology. And then he says, however, as high school students in the state of Louisiana, you are entitled to learn an alternative theory supported by no scientific evidence whatsoever. And he begins teaching, and if you look in the bottom right panel, he's actually drawn a picture on his chalkboard. Now instead of the cell and the mitochondria, it's Noah and the ark and the sky. And he's interrupted by, says, Mr. Stiller, please stop. I'd like to get into a good college. And the teacher says, almost done. So Noah took 2 of everything, including the microbes, but forgot the dinosaurs. And I thought that this is obviously a slam on the requirement of teaching creationism in a science classroom. I do think that people have a right to their religious beliefs, but I do think that when we're teaching science that we need to teach the things that we have a scientific basis for. And I just thought that it was amusing that this was in the paper on the Sunday before I was going to be teaching you guys about evolution. I normally start out when I talk about evolution by stating that I have been able to personally reconcile my scientific beliefs and my religious beliefs, and that in a science classroom, the things that we teach are the things that can be proven by the scientific method, and that's why we start this class out with scientific method and those kinds of things. That's not to say that people should not believe things based on faith, but that's to say that in a science classroom, what we talk about is the science that we teach. And I think that this comic gets at the heart of why we tend to separate those two things, why we don't teach things that are faith-based in the classroom, and why we don't always teach science in religious settings. The problem that you run into is that in a science classroom, we're expected to meet science competencies. And when you apply to college, they expect that you know science competencies. And if we confuse the science with the other things that we believe, then we'll run into some real trouble. So I thought that was kind of an interesting cartoon to have, and I'll make sure that the link is up. So I thought it was amusing, and I wanted to share that with you guys. And it's also a way to say that there is room for both, but in a science classroom, that those are the things that we talk about aren't the things that are supported by the science. So let me know if you guys have questions. I have to run at 2 o'clock. I have a meeting, but I'll be on the discussion board. Thank you, Danielle. I am feeling better. I'm still coughing a little bit, and I've had my water bottle here with me, but I sound much better. You guys would not have wanted to listen to me for an hour last week. I tried to yell at my kid, and it came out as a croak, and she kind of didn't even listen to me. My mom was laughing. It was really bad. So I'm doing much better, and hopefully we'll be able to stay on track for the rest of the summer. We're almost done. Hang in there, everybody. So I will be on the discussion board later on to check for questions and to finish up some grading I need to do. So you guys will see that soon. And I will talk to you guys later.